This is the lesson for 8-4 for algebra. What we're talking about today is standard of deviation. What the standard of deviation is that it's a measure of how spread out the data is from the mean. So the smaller the standard of deviation, the more reliable, the more predictable your data is. The larger the standard deviation, the less predictable or less consistent your data is. Okay. So when you do your one variable statistics, it is very important that you remember because you'll be using the mean today. All right. The mean is that first one in your one variable statistics. It's the X with the little line above it. And then we're going to be using this one today. All right. This one is your standard of deviation. It's the little zero with the little line on top of it. All right. That's your standard deviation. Again, the bigger the number, the less predictable, or sorry, the bigger number, the less predictable your less predictable, less reliable your data is. The smaller the number, the more predictable and more reliable your number is. So when we take a look at this first one, it says Miss Webb is determining which student she should add to the spelling bee roster that would represent the high school. The chart shows the 10 most recent scores for 3 students. So pretend that this is out of 100. So this Jack person scored, now remember, you're doing a spelling bee, so you want high scores, all right? Jack scored a 33 on a spelling test, a 32, a 30, and so on and so forth. Aaliyah scored a 20, some 40s, some 50s, and an 80. And Timar did he got a 5 on one, but then he got a 95 on another. So he's sort of unpredictable. So we use the mean and standard deviation when the data is symmetric. All of this data is symmetric. All right. We have box and whisker plots for each one. You can tell that it's about half and half on both sides. Remember, we draw our line right down where the median is, and about half our data is above and about half is below. So these are all symmetric. You use the mean when it's symmetric. You know that from the previous lesson. But when you use the mean, you also use the standard deviation when the data is symmetric. So looking at this data, this one, Aaliyah has a very small standard or small interquartile range. Jack's is a little bit bigger. Timar's is even bigger. So again, remember the smaller interquartile range, the more consistent and more reliable the data. So let's take a look at the mean and the standard deviation for all of these. So I need to split my screen here. So I already went through earlier today, and this isn't going to let me do this, is it? 1 second. Now I should be able to share my screen. All right, now we're in business here. So I went through earlier today, and I typed all my data in for L1, L2, and L3 for Jack, Aaliyah, and Timar. So the directions say find the mean and standard deviation for each student. So remember, the way that you do this is you go to Stat, go over to Calc, one variable statistics. We want L1. I type my Jack data into L1. So I want to go down to Calculate, hit Enter. So our mean for Jack is 50. Our standard deviation, remember, it's this little circle with the little line above it. That's standard deviation. We're just going to round it to the nearest hundredth. All right. On your homework today, you'll have some questions that you have to round to the nearest hundredth. Some questions you have to round to the nearest tenth. We need to do the same thing for Aaliyah. So I typed Aaliyah's data into L2. So instead of L1 here, I want to choose second L2 and then calculate. So for Aaliyah, I got a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of about 14.13. And then for Timar, I typed the data into L3. and I got a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 32.23. So when we take a look at this data, if we thought about it really for a second, if you wanted to pick somebody to go into the spelling bee, obviously you want the person to have lots and lots of correct answers. All right. So if we chose a student for the spelling bee, notice that all three of our means were exactly the same. So the students are scoring an average score that is exactly the same. They're getting half of their words right and they're getting half of their words wrong. So in the spelling bee, would you want somebody that is going to be very consistent or somebody who's going to be very inconsistent? Somebody that scores relatively about the same thing each time, or somebody that could score really, really good or really, really bad? Well, there's different means of thought here, all right? Even in sports, all right? Do you want the person that is a more consistent scorer, or somebody that some games scores nothing and sometimes scores a lot? Different ways of thinking about things, all right? If you wanted somebody that was more consistent, more predictable data, then you would want to choose Aaliyah, because her standard of deviation compared to the other three is the lowest. So Aaliyah's would be the most predictable score. She's going to be the most consistent. All right. She's going to be the most consistent score, most reliable data. Where if we chose somebody like Timar, notice Timar's scores, you might score single digits, but you might score 95 as well. So he's all over the place. Where Aaliyah's scores are relatively more consistent. Notice that most of hers are in the 40s and 50s, right? She does have her high and her low, but Timar's scores are all over the place. So Timar's is the least consistent, all right? It's sort of the more all over the place type score, because his standard deviation is highest. The lower the standard deviation, the more reliable and predictable your data is, the more consistent it is. The higher your standard deviation, the more all over the place and wildly inconsistent your data is. Some people, if they are choosing a spelling bee, might want to choose Jack. All right. He has his good days, he has his bad days, but his high highs aren't as high as Timar. His low lows aren't as low as Timar. So he's sort of in the middle. All right. If I was choosing somebody, I'd want the more consistent person probably with Aaliyah, because I wouldn't want to be the low low. Although you could probably make an argument for the high high with Tamar if you're trying to win the spelling bee. The next one talks about temperatures. All right. So we have our temperatures here for different years on January 1st. We have like 16 different years of temperatures and 16 different years of temperatures for April 1st. I went through and I figured out the mean and the median already. The mean for January was 37.125, and the standard deviation is 10.06. For April, the mean was 51 and the standard deviation was 11.62. So which month, either January or April, has the more predictable temperatures? All right. Now, the more predictable temperatures has the lower standard deviation. So notice that January goes from, like a low of 23 to a high of 52, where April goes from a low of, looks like the lowest is 35 to a high of 77. All right. So this one has the lower standard of deviation. Therefore, it is the more predictable temperature. The lower standard deviation gives you the more predictable temperature. Sometimes you'll have to find them from a dot plot. So again, remember, for our dot plot, we would have to type in 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 70, 70, 71, 71 to find all of your data. All right, you'd have to type it into L1 and L2. For our mean, for this first one, for the home team, for our mean, we got a mean of 68.7 when we type it in, and we get a standard deviation of 2. For our visiting team, we got a mean of 68.5, and we got a standard deviation of approximately 1.74. So which team is more predictable for height? All right, the more predictable data is the lower standard deviation. So the more predictable would be the visiting team because that has the lower standard deviation. If we take a look at this one, again, we'd have to type all these numbers into our L1 and into our L2. So you'd have 4 1s, 2 2s, a 3, a 7, 2 8s, and 2 9s. The mean here for this is Danette and Alfonso. We're talking about repair times. So the mean here takes Danette about 4.3 hours on average, and her standard deviation is about 3.35. For Alfonso, his mean is about 5.16, and his standard deviation is 1.95. So where Alfonso takes a little bit longer on average, because remember the mean is the average, he's more consistent with his times. Where Danette sometimes repairs it a little bit more quickly, but then other times takes a longer time. So she doesn't have a lot of data in the middle here. She either does things really, really quick or really, really slow, where Alfonso is sort of in the middle here, and he's consistent at his times. Now, there's one little outlier here, but he's very consistent with his times. I know that he's more consistent because our standard deviation was a lot lower compared to Danette. Danette's standard deviation was a lot higher. She had more diverse times, where Alfonso was more reliable, more predictable with his data, more consistent with his data, found by the lower standard deviation. So which person is more reliable? It would definitely be Alfonso, because the nets are all over the place. So again, on your calculator today, this is the symbol for mean. You have to type your numbers into your L1 and L2, do your one variable statistics. That's the symbol for mean. This is the symbol for standard deviation. The lower the standard of deviation, the more predictable and reliable your data is. The higher standard of deviation, the more all over the place your numbers are, the less predictable the data